Yeah, right. So I could very quickly fill in that column. Okay. So anytime I have any fixed costs, I know that I'm in the short run. Okay? Now, if I then want to kind of think about, right, what they are, I have to know that when I'm producing nothing, all of my costs are fixed costs, right? Because I have variable cost of 0 if I produce nothing. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Yeah. So we're good with this one. Okay. So before I go to 18, I'll show you one that I think would be kind of helpful, right? So if I'm looking at this table, I would actually kind of scroll down to 30 here. This might be a harder one to find. So with all the other questions I could ask you, like with a table like this, usually I'm either giving you a total and asking you about an average. Well, anytime I have an average, so this doesn't matter if it's average total cost, this could be average variable, this could be average fixed. All an average is the total divided by quantity. So if I give you the quantity, I give you the average, you can always use a little bit of algebra to then solve for what those total costs must be. Same kind of idea would apply if I gave you an average variable cost, you know the quantity, you could always back out what that total variable cost is, right? If I know any two pieces of information from this equation, I can always solve for the third. Now, marginal cost might be a little bit trickier, right? So my marginal cost is the change in my total cost divided by a change in quantity. So I think in this one I was asking, what's the marginal cost of the second unit? Right? So this might be an example where I kind of want to add something in, right? So if I look at the second unit, the change in my total cost would actually be what was my total cost at the second and how much did it change by? I would need to know the total cost of the first. How could I find the total cost of my first unit here? It would just be the sum of my fixed and variable. So what was the change in my total cost? 40. Now, it won't always be this easy. Like on the exam, I might not give you changes in the quantity of 1. Maybe it's like changes of 10 or 5, right? But here I've just got a change in the quantity as 1. So 40 over 1, my marginal cost would be 40. Okay. Now, here's where, let's say I didn't have these total variable costs. For a second, let's assume that I'm just trying to figure it out. What would my total variable cost be at the second unit? Well, if I know that my total costs are 750, my total fixed costs are 700, the difference between those would just be my total variable costs, or 40. So let's say I didn't give you the total costs, and I only gave you variable costs. Let's say I didn't want to use that total cost column. I don't want to come up with any additional work. When we're looking at the variable costs, or sorry, when we're looking at the change in total cost, do fixed costs ever change? They were always 700, right? That column was always the same. So another way you can find marginal cost, it would be a change in my, well, the only changes in my total costs come from my variable costs. So hopefully if I do the same thing here, before we had what? 750 minus 710 divided by a change from 2 to 1. I'd have the same thing here, but the change in my variable costs, oh, I hit the wrong button. There we go. What were, actually, this wasn't 40. This was supposed to be 50, wasn't it? Didn't I have 750 in there before? Sorry. So the reason why I was thinking 40 is because what's the change in my variable cost going from 10 to 50? 40. So I would find, right, the exact same marginal cost of 40, whether or not I use the change in my total cost or I use the change in my variable costs. Okay? Any questions on that idea? Can marginal cost be negative, right? So what would have to be true is my total costs were actually going down, right? So we said, variable costs, as I produce more, what's always happening? They're always going up. So no, we should never have negative marginal costs, right? We should always have that the total cost is kind of changing by some positive amount. Yep. Yeah, so this is where if I give you certain values, there might be one where it's a little bit different, but I'm only asking you about specific ones. So I might do something kind of odd, where I think if you actually fill out this column, it looks like my variable costs are going down, but that's because I'm not asking you to fill out the whole table. I'm only asking you about specific values. So I don't want you to just know, oh, variable costs are always increasing. So from a multiple choice list, I could just rule out what the answers are. I want you to be actually able to calculate those values, right? So it would be a little bit different in this table because the things I left out, I came up with a number that would require you not to just use kind of process of elimination, but actually calculate the value. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Okay. And then you said you had a question on 18, right? So if I go back to 18, so which of the following is not true, right? So when I'm talking about indifference curves, how would I draw these out, right? So if I'm thinking about an indifference curve, what it represents, and this is why we could put it on the same graph as our budget constraint, was it's all the combinations of two goods that lead to the same level of total utility, or we kind of call this like indifference curve 1, right? So maybe this was 100. So what we said is true about indifference curves is that essentially they're like parallel shifts outward, right? Higher indifference curves would represent what? Well, I would have the same amount of one good, but more of the other. So what should be happening to my total utility? It should be always increasing. If I have the same of one good, more of the other, I should be happier than before, or my total utility should always be going up as I'm looking at higher indifference curves, okay? Now, when I'm thinking about the slope of my indifference curve, we always draw them kind of bowed inward. So what is that telling us? That as I have more of this X good, right, what is happening to the slope of my indifference curve? It's becoming flatter, right? What is the slope of my indifference curve? We would call that the marginal rate of substitution, or this is where it's a little bit counterintuitive. When we look at this graph, you would calculate the slope using the change in the quantity of y over the quantity of x. When we're talking about the marginal rate of substitution, we're not writing that in terms of quantities. We're writing that in terms of marginal utility, right? So this is where it gets kind of flipped, right? I went through in class kind of more detail when we were looking at like the budget constraint. The reason why is because quantities are really coming from income over prices. That's why the prices, it was the price of X over the price of Y. The same sort of idea would exist with total utility. This isn't technically quite correct, but let's say like you think about where these indifference curves would intersect, right? They don't actually ever hit the Y and X intercept, but let's just for a second assume they did. You could think of it this way, why that marginal rate of substitution is flipped. So it would be how much of the X good would I have? Well, if I'm keeping total utility the same, it would be total utility over the marginal utility of X, total utility over the marginal utility of Y. If I used these represent quantities, if I do the change in the quantity of Y over the change in the quantity of X, I would have what? Total utility over the marginal utility of Y divided by the total utility over the marginal utility of X. If I do a little bit of algebra here and rearrange things, what I end up with is this, right? So that's why it is counterintuitive, because when we use quantities to calculate slope, what is really behind the quantities? Well, it's some function of total utility to marginal utility. And so the marginal utilities actually end up being kind of the reverse of what you would do if you had the quantities to calculate slope. If I don't give you the quantity, and a lot of these questions, do I ever give you the quantities? I mean, when I'm asking you about marginal rate of substitution here, do I ever give you quantities in like 19, 20, 21? So do you think I'm going to give you quantities on the exam? No. So you're probably going to have to use your prices or marginal utilities, right? To be a little bit more comprehensive, right? If I think about this marginal rate of substitution to answer some of these other questions, right? I could think about, you know, where I have the consumer optimum is always where the slope of my indifference curve is the same as what? The slope of my we don't know this is going to be a problem. At the consumer optimum, the slope of my indifference curve should be the same as the slope of my income or budget constraint, right? So I've got my budget constraint. These slopes should be the same. What did we just say? The slope of my indifference curve is this relative margin utility of X to the margin utility of Y. What is the slope of my budget constraint? Well, there we're not worried about margin utility. This is just how much I can afford. What changes how much I can afford? My income, but also prices. So the slope of my budget constraint was always my relative prices. So at that consumer optimum, what must be true? If the slopes are the same, the price of X over the price of Y is equal to my marginal rate of substitution, or that relative price is the same as the relative margin utilities. If we rearrange this equation, what did we end up with? We said when we're spending optimally, what should be the same for all goods? The marginal utility per dollar I'm spending. So the marginal utility, if I just rearrange these equations, what I can come up with, what that's really saying is at that consumer optimum, the marginal utility per dollar of both goods should be the same. Okay. All right. So when we're talking about which of the following is not true, so what is true, it's the different combinations of these two goods that give me the same amount of total utility. Higher quantities of X, we said, should lead to a flatter, not a steeper slope, right? So that one's not going to be true. So that's the correct answer. They never cross. We kind of went through a thought experiment in class Y, but for the sake of studying for the exam, I would just think about you're drawing these indifference curves. They're like parallel shifts. They never cross, okay? And then the slope of the indifference curve, this is just always representing our marginal rate of substitution, okay? So if instead I asked you not about the slope, but let's say I asked you about the marginal rate of substitution. Maybe let's do one here, okay? So maybe this is like anytime I add something in here, I'm probably doing it for a reason. I'm not just drawing this for the sake of drawing it. I wrote the exam, so I might know what would be a good question to know how to answer, right? So if I've got my indifference curve, right? Let's say I saw that I buy more of the y-axis good. What's going to happen to my marginal rate of substitution? Well, if I buy more of the y-axis good, I could think about, let's say I'm just starting here. What direction would I be moving on my indifference curve? If I'm buying more of y, I'm moving up or to the left. What's happening to my slope? It's getting steeper. So my marginal rate of substitution is getting, so the marginal rate of substitution is just the absolute value of that slope. So my marginal rate of substitution would be going. Another way to think about this is what is my marginal rate of substitution? It's the marginal utility of y over the marginal utility of x. If I have, if I'm buying more of something, or sorry, I'm writing quickly. There we go, right? So if I have my marginal rate of substitution, if I'm buying more of good y, as I have more of a good, what is happening to that good's marginal utility? So it's all the way back in like module 3, it follows the same principle as the demand curve. As I buy more, my marginal benefit is going. So as I buy more of y, what's happening to the marginal utility of y? It's going. If I buy more of it, that means my marginal utility is going, which then, if I have a smaller denominator, what's happening to my marginal rate of substitution? It's going up, which is exactly what that visual tells us, right? That as I buy more of the y good, my marginal rate of substitution is going up. Said differently, what if I buy more of good x? As I have more of good x, what's happening to the marginal utility of the last unit of x I bought? It's getting smaller. So if I buy more of good x, the marginal utility of the last is going down. What would be happening to my marginal rate of substitution there? If my numerator is smaller, then that value is going down. Or my slope is becoming flatter. right? Kind of those are just two different ways of saying the same thing. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Okay. All right. So where are we at in time? Okay. So before I ask, does anybody have questions over some of the newer stuff on like HHI and four-firm concentration ratios? No? Okay. So what I will kind of tell you about those is some of the practice problems are probably a little bit more in depth than what you would need to know, right? When it comes to the exam, and this is where you won't have these equations, so you'll have to have these kind of memorized, right? But if I want that four-firm concentration ratio, what do I simply do? Add up the percentage sales of the top four firms. So I'll just give you a hypothetical. Let's say I had two firms, each with 50%. Sorry. What would the four-firm concentration ratio be? What if I have four firms now that are evenly splitting? What would happen to my four-firm concentration ratio? Would it increase? Would it decrease? It would stay the same. I'll be telling you this for a reason, right? So if we think about the four-firm concentration ratio, I can't distinguish between four firms or fewer. It'll always look like it's 100% of the market. So this is where when I had examples where I was giving you like the total sales, on the exam, I will give you what the market share is in terms of a percentage. You won't actually have to calculate it, right? I would do something similar to this, where I tell you that each firm has 50% of the overall sales, or each firm has 25%, or they're evenly splitting it. Okay? Now, when we're talking about my HHI, if I had an HHI where they were both evenly splitting it, so I had two firms, I don't simply add them up. What do I need to do to calculate the HHI? Square them. So if I do this, I think I get 5,000, if I'm doing math in my head correct, right? What happens, let's say I don't add an additional firm, but let's just say that this market becomes more concentrated with one firm. So this is where the four-firm concentration ratio, let's say instead of 50-50 split, it's now 90-10. What would happen to the four-firm concentration ratio? Two firms still, so still 100. But my HHI, if this is a measure of market concentration, if there's a higher market share percent with one firm, that value for my HHI should be higher. In fact, you can kind of remember what's the highest HHI possible if I only had one firm or a monopoly. What would my HHI be? 100 squared or 10,000. The lowest possible is if I had an infinite of number of firms, which each market share would technically be there approximately zero. We can't actually have an infinite number of firms, but the lowest HHI of like what we would call a perfectly competitive market should be zero. So higher HHI represents a less competitive market, closer to a monopoly. So if I now have a 90-10 split, even if I don't want to waste time calculating what this value is, what do I know the HHI has to be larger than? Well, if it was 5,000 when I had two firms evenly splitting it, the HHI, when I have one firm that has a higher market share, this new HHI should be higher or greater than that 5,000. Right? Now I could go through and actually calculate it. What's it going to be? 8,100 plus 100, 8,200. Sure enough, it goes up. So I can always take the time to like calculate it. But if I'm thinking about like exam time management, as soon as I know that it's a less competitive market, I automatically know the HHI has to be greater than what it was before. Okay? What if instead I add a third firm and I say that they are evenly splitting it? I would have what? 33.33 repeated squared 3 times. What do I know has to be true about that HHI? It has to be less than 5,000. If I ask you for the specific value, you have to go through and calculate it, but I'm much more likely to ask you if this changes, will the HHI be above or below kind of the old value? Okay? There you know a higher HHI represents a less competitive market or more concentrated with one firm. Okay? So this is about the extent I'll kind of ask you about HHI from concentration ratios. You need to know how to calculate them, but only given sale. I'm only going to give you what that market share is as a percent. I'm not going to have you calculate or kind of not calculate, take like the sales and convert it into market share percentage. I'll just give you the percent right away. Okay? I'm thinking about comparing to old practice problems. All right. Okay, I've got some notes for myself, things I think could be important for you guys. Okay, any other questions that people want to see worked through here? Yep. So if I go all the way back to 5, so this is kind of stuff we've covered a while ago. So what would the value of this tax be? So if I have my supply curve and I have my supply curve plus the tax, what should be true about the difference between those curves at every quantity? Well, the cost to the company or whatever they were before plus what? The value of the tax. So if I'm looking at this graph vertically, the difference between my supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax, that difference is just the tax. So I could use any point, look at that difference between my old supply curve and the new supply curve plus the tax. What's the value of that tax? I'm going from 40 to 80, so 40. You're not comparing the equilibriums. Those are at 2 different quantities. You need to be looking at the same quantity and then the difference between those 2 curves, that difference is just the value of the tax. Right? So just to kind of couple things with what another question could be, let's say I had a negative externality and I had a very similar depiction. All right? It tells me something slightly different though. If I'm now thinking about negative externalities, I've got my supply curve, which reflects marginal costs, my demand curve, which reflects marginal benefits. So anytime you're talking about an externality, I would start out drawing, where is the market? Where is the market going to choose where supply is equal to demand, or the private marginal costs are equal to the private marginal benefits? I said in this class, to make it easier on you, I'm only ever going to model negative externalities through what? And you should only ever need to model them through the supply curve. That reflects costs. So if I have a negative externality, at every single quantity, the cost to society, or whatever the cost of the producers was plus the external cost or the value of that negative externality. So my marginal social cost would be up here. If I only have negative externalities, what's my marginal social benefit? The same as what it was before. So where does the market want the equilibrium to be? Where the marginal social benefit is equal to my marginal social cost. That's going to be at what? A lower quantity. So the market is at a quantity that is too high. What does this look really similar to? What did I just jump from a question on? Taxes. So if I have a marginal social cost, how can I push the market back to that lower socially efficient quantity? I could use a tax. So if I had a similar depiction, how can I identify the value of the external cost? It's the exact same. It's the difference between my marginal cost and my marginal social cost. In fact, my social costs are just my marginal cost, which I get from the supply curve, plus the external cost. So what would the optimal value of the tax be? Setting a tax that is exactly equal to my external cost. That way, I would get my supply curve to match up perfectly with society's supply curve or society's marginal costs. Okay. Now, what else could I use here if I had negative externalities? So if I've got negative externalities, we just said we could use a tax to lower the quantity. What other tools did the government have? I could use a quota, or I could use a effective price floor, price ceiling. Okay. Now, if I had positive externalities, right, what's the only tool that we would use there? Subsidies, but we can maybe look through the model and think about different questions we could be asked. So once again, if I have positive externalities, I'm writing up, there we go, right? So marginal cost, marginal benefit, and I'm thinking about if I have a positive externality. So the market is going to arrive here, right? Where would my positive externality, how would I model that? Well, if it's an additional benefit, I'm going to model it through the demand curve. Demand curve represents benefits. So at every point, my marginal social benefit is higher with positive externalities. I don't have any negative externalities, so my marginal social costs are still the same as what they would have been to the private, my private marginal cost. So the quantity that the society would want with a positive externality, and once again, this is kind of intuitive, if there's positive externalities, society would want more than what the market stops at. So what's the only tool we said we can use here to increase quantity? Use subsidies, or kind of use subsidies to exactly get our demand curve plus the subsidy to match up with whatever society's demand curve was. Now, so we can only use subsidies here. One thing that's a little bit tricky, sometimes people make a mistake on, they see this and they go, oh, okay, this is an S, by the way. Sorry, I'm writing quick. Okay, this is what's true about the price that society would want. Relative to the market, the price society wants is actually higher. So some people incorrectly say, well, you could also use a price kind of floor and don't prevent the price from getting lower. The only problem is if we don't make the consumers internalize this additional benefit, what would a price floor actually do? Well, for consumers, anybody past this point, what's true about the marginal benefit relative to what's the consumer's marginal cost? The price they pay. So every point here, for the consumers, the marginal benefit is below the new price. So where would the market actually stop at? A lower quantity. So that's why we can't use price ceilings or price floors to increase quantity, right? So don't get that confused, right? I'm drawing in here to show you why it's not going to work. The only thing that works to increase the market quantity is the use of subsidies, okay? Any questions on this? Okay. Any other questions people want to see worked through here? Yeah. Yeah, so if we're looking at the same graph, and I'll kind of draw it out for us here. And we want to identify what the price the consumer pays is and what the tax revenue is. So I might add a question in here that might be helpful, okay? So let's say I've got my supply curve, I've got my demand curve, and I have my supply curve plus the tax, right? So I won't use the values. We'll jump back over to the practice exam to use values because values can change. So it's a better idea to be able to identify what those values represent to us, okay? So the point where supply is equal to demand is going to be what? The quantity that the market would arrive at before the tax. After the tax, the new quantity will be where our new supply curve is hitting that demand curve. So this is what? 60 and 100, I think, right? What does this point represent? So if I think about this old point where supply is equal to demand, this was like my market or my equilibrium price, which was 50, okay? So if I have a tax, what does this value represent? This is the new price. So if you think about it this way, you can always remember, a tax does what to both producers and consumers? It hurts both of them. So when I have a tax, what happens to my consumer and producer surplus? They would both decrease. If I have a subsidy, what will always happen to producer and consumer surplus? They will both increase. So if we know that with a tax, producers and consumers are hurt, the new price that consumers pay, is it going to be higher or lower than 50? Higher. If they're worse off, they're going to pay a higher price. So when we identify this new price after the tax, this is going to represent the price that consumers pay. Right? So in our example, this was 80. How would I identify? I don't think the question asked for this, but what's the price that the seller gets to keep? Even if I didn't give you the graph and I just told you, the new price consumers pay is 80, and the value of the tax we said was what? 40, I think before. What must be the price the sellers keep? whatever money I hand over, I give them $80, but they then have to pay the government 40. How much are they left with? 40, right? So if we take the price the consumer pays, that's going to be equal to the price the seller gets to keep plus the tax. What's that difference between the supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax? That was how we identified the value of the tax. So the price that the seller keeps will be at our new quantity after the tax. Where are we at on the supply curve? The price that the seller keeps, I think we were told, was 40. Sure enough, if the producers are worse off, should the price that they get to keep be higher or lower than before? Well, price to them is a good thing. So if they're worse off, the price they keep is going to be lower. Sure enough, it is here, right? So if I'm thinking about, I could ask you to identify the price the consumer pays or the price the seller keeps. All right, so once again, these practice exams, people are like, well, it doesn't look the same as the exam. Well, I'm going to change the questions, but if you understand a tax model, just because the practice exam asks you about the price the consumer pays, you should also be able to identify for me the price that the seller keeps. That wasn't in the problem, but maybe that's something I would ask you about. Okay, all right, this is where the video might not always capture what I'm doing in class, right? So another thing we could think about, what's going to happen to producer and consumer surplus here, right? So I'll get to the question eventually. I know I haven't answered every part of it yet, but I'm adding some things in for a reason, right? What is producer surplus? Anytime I talk about surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to that group. What represents the marginal cost to producers? I usually write it, but I was going quickly. It is always the supply curve. What's the marginal benefit to producers? The price, but now with a tax, it's the price that the sellers get to keep. So what's my new producer surplus? The difference between the price the seller keeps and the supply curve for every quantity sold after the tax. Okay. Now, I'll kind of have a lot of things going on in this graph, but if you think about why did producer surplus go down, what would producer surplus be without the tax? The old market price, the difference between that and the supply curve, but it would go all the way up to the quantity of the market. So before, producer surplus would have been this entire area, which once again, how would I calculate that if I asked you for the actual value? Just the area of a triangle, right? Base times height times 1. What happened to producer surplus after the tax? It went down, right? So with a tax, producer surplus decreased. What about consumer surplus? That's the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to the consumers. What's their marginal benefit represented by? Should hopefully be very quick responses. The demand curve. What's the marginal cost of the consumer? When you buy something, the cost to you is the price, right? Once we have a tax, it's going to be the price that consumers pay. So what's the difference between our demand curve and the price that the consumer pays after the tax? Here would be our consumer surplus. And we could calculate that area if I gave you, the intercept, and we would just be looking at the area of a triangle there, okay? That's what surplus is. But the marginal benefit and marginal costs are very different for those two groups, right? What is the marginal benefit to consumers? The price. What is the marginal cost to, what is the marginal benefit to the consumers? The marginal benefit to consumers is demand. What's the marginal benefit to producers? The price they sell it for, right? Whereas what's the marginal cost to consumers? The price they pay. Whereas what's the marginal kind of cost to producers? Represented by the supply curve. So it's still, anytime we talk about economic surplus, it's always the difference between marginal benefits and marginal cost, but for that group. So if we're talking about consumers and producers, it's going to look a little bit different. Now, if we're talking about total surplus, what would total surplus be? The difference between simply our supply and demand curve. We don't care where it's coming from. We just care about total surplus in the market. Our marginal benefits and marginal costs aren't going to be related to prices. It's just going to be the difference between our supply and demand curves. We'll finish this and we'll kind of move on, okay? So we saw, what would a consumer surplus have been without the tax? Well, the old price would have been down here. So now we'd be looking at the old price of the market. Consumer surplus used to be all of this area. So what happened to consumer surplus? It also decreased, right? So we end up with producer and consumer surplus went down. Now, anytime we have deadweight loss, that's coming from just the fact that there used to be units that we were selling before the tax that we no longer are. So we're missing out on all of this surplus. So kind of this little triangle here would represent the surplus we lost out on or our deadweight loss. Once again, area of a triangle, we could calculate this. Right? In fact, I've got all the values I would need. So, right, 80 minus 40 times, this was not 1,000, sorry, 100 minus 60 times a half. Now, the second part of this question, if you were asking about that, I left one thing out here, which is once the government gets involved, what other surplus do I have? Consumer, producer, but also government surplus. How much money is the government making when they have a tax? The value of the tax multiplied by. So if I think about the government tax revenue, it's simply the value of the tax multiplied by however many units are sold after the tax. Visually, what is that in the graph? Well, what is the difference between the price that the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps? That difference was the value of the tax. What's the base of that rectangle? The quantity after the tax. So what would this rectangle represent here? This would all be tax revenue, right? So non-technical way, when I have taxes, that big rectangle in the middle, that's my tax revenue, right? The little triangle on top, what's always on top? I said not technical, but it's consumer surplus is on top. What's always on the bottom, that little triangle, that would be producer surplus, and whatever that little triangle is on the right, that's going to be our deadweight loss, okay? So I don't know, what, 40 times 60, so 2,400 would be the tax revenue. And I saw a hand up. Yeah. Yep, so why would I include it in the total surplus? Because I now have consumer, producer, and government surplus. Tax revenue is positive, so I'm adding it in. That's why the only surplus I'm losing out on. So without a tax, total surplus was this entire triangle. After the tax, if I add up producer, consumer, and government surplus, the only surplus I lost was right here. Yep. That's my supply curve. If I'm selling something for less money and I'm selling fewer units, what has to happen to my surplus? Has to go down. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? So once again, in connection with this question 9, but also 8, I would think about what always happens with a tax. My consumer and producer surplus will always go, trying to help you out, down, right? Should make efficient use of this time. I'm asking you questions. Who's hurt with the tax? Both consumers and producers. Producer and consumer surplus will decrease. Okay? So hold on, because I had a question before. Are there any other questions on this one? So someone asked me before about subsidies. Was it you? So what was your question about subsidies? Yeah, so I would be a little bit more focused in terms of, instead of calculating consumer or producer surplus with a subsidy, and I'll draw it out kind of quickly for you. But if we're thinking about a market where we have a subsidy, and this is one where I did post an additional video that might help with this, be a little bit more in depth than what we were able to cover right now. if I have a subsidy and I give it to consumers, this is kind of the way I always model it for you. So that's the only way I'm going to show you on the exam. We would think about my demand curve plus the subsidy is up here. Okay. So the new price, we said subsidies will always do what to quantity? Increase it, right? But what is it going to do? I just said a tax hurts both people. We said a subsidy is going to help both consumers and producers. So relative to the old price, what would this price actually represent? After the subsidy, my new equilibrium price will be the price for who? Consumers or producers? Well, if both people are better off, what's going to happen if there's going to be a higher price for who is a higher price good for? Producers. So this would be the price that the producers keep or the sellers keep. If consumers are better off, what's going to be true about the price that the consumer pays? It's going to be lower. So the price the seller gets to keep, if I subtract the value of the subsidy, right? That's the difference between these two lines. This would represent the new price consumers pay. The price the consumer pays goes down. The price the seller keeps goes up. So what is going to happen is surplus for both of these individuals has to go up, right? Because the price for the seller is their marginal benefit. The price for the consumer is their marginal cost. So for the consumer, their costs are lower. Surplus will go up. For producers, their benefit is now higher. Their surplus will go up as well, okay? So with subsidies, we see both consumer and producer surplus go up, okay? Now, if I wanted to, I might ask you to calculate one of these for me, okay? I know they overlap, so I would likely only ask you about one. So if I wanted to calculate, let's just say consumer surplus here. What is the marginal benefit to consumers? It's always represented by the demand curve. The marginal cost will be to the consumers the, not supply, the price they pay. So where is consumer surplus after this subsidy? Well, the new quantity is out here. Where's my demand curve? Right here. So that difference between my demand curve and the new price that consumers pay, this would be the value of consumer surplus. So if I gave you some values here, it's the area of a triangle, you could calculate this for me. Okay? Now, if I instead had asked you about producer surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs to producers. What's their marginal benefit? So when they sell something, the marginal benefit is the price they keep. What's their marginal cost represented by? Supply curve. So producer surplus after the subsidy will be the difference between our supply curve and the price that they get to keep, right? So there is overlap in producer and consumer surplus when we have subsidies. So how do we see dead weight loss with subsidies? Well, who's paying for the subsidy? How much are they going to pay? Whatever the value of the subsidy is times the number of units sold. So this big rectangle in the middle, kind of similar to taxes, this would now represent what? Not tax revenue, but we call this kind of government or subsidy expenditure. This is a cost to the government. So when we calculate total surplus, this would be subtracted. So even though there's kind of overlap in all these things, we're having consumer and producer surplus double counted, but then we subtract it out once because it's now a government expense. But what's true about this area here? It was additional government expense that wasn't producer or consumer surplus. So the overproduction of these units, our dead weight loss with subsidies is now going to be this triangle on the right. So not a technical way of remembering this, but I will give you a little bit of a hint or a good way to remember this as you're studying. With taxes, sometimes rely on your intuition. Do we want, after a tax, are we going to have more or less than before? Less. So what direction is that triangle pointing towards? Well, because we have less, what do we actually want? We want to be out at the old market equilibrium. My triangle points to the right, right? right? So after a tax, I want to be back at the old equilibrium. So my dead weight loss triangle is saying I want to be back at that old equilibrium. It points to the right. With a subsidy, if we want to have no dead weight loss, subsidies will increase the quantity. So to get back to the market equilibrium, we would actually want to move to the left, which is why our kind of dead weight loss triangle, it's pointing to the left. That's not a technical way of remembering it, but if that kind of helps you as you're working through these models, that's why the dead weight loss triangles kind of point in opposite directions. Or that is one way to remember that they point in opposite directions. Okay? It's part of it, right? That's where it's coming from, right? We have this huge government expense, which, what did we say is happening to producer and consumer surplus? They're both going up, but at the same time, government expenditures are going up by a lot as well, and this is a negative value. So the increase to producers and consumers is washed out by this huge expense, which is how we end up with a dead weight loss. Yep. If I'm asking you about the total surplus after the tax. Yep. Somewhere over here. Did you get your question answered? No? Okay. I saw a hand here. If you decide to. Any other questions on this one specifically, then we'll kind of keep moving on. Okay, so who had the question that was, I said, hold off on a second. Yeah. So 19. Okay, so we're kind of switching gears here a little bit. So if I'm thinking about 19, I've got prices, I've got income, and I'm asking you about the slope of your budget line, right? So there's a couple ways of doing this. Probably the easiest way would be to just simply kind of remember this fact. We talked about it earlier. If I put what good on the x-axis, textbooks, pizza on my y-axis, what will the slope of my budget constraint always be, or my income constraint? It's the price of my X good over the price of my Y good. So here, the price of textbooks over the price of pizza, which here they were what, 120? So I should have 5 here. Now, it's always downward sloping. So technically, the slope would be what? -5, right? Now, you'll notice I don't try to trick you on these types of questions. If I'm asking about the slope of a budget constraint, all the options are negative, right? So it's simply knowing the slope of that budget constraint is always going to be the relative price of your X good to the price of your Y good. Now, if I ask you in the same problem, right, what's the marginal rate of substitution here? So what does the marginal rate of substitution represent? The slope of my, we don't know this, it's going to be a problem Thursday, the indifference curve, right? So we said when we're spending optimally, if I tell you that this person is maximizing utility, the slope of my budget constraint should be the exact same as the slope of my indifference curve, which is my marginal rate of substitution. Now, typically in a question where I ask you about marginal rate of substitution, I would give you these all as positive amounts because we're typically just looking at the absolute value. So here, if I gave you options, the marginal rate of substitution would be equal to 5, right? Just the absolute value of that slope, right? Okay. Like I said, I'm not going to try to trick you with giving you some positive and some negative values. Typically, for the marginal rate of substitution, I'm giving you these in terms of the absolute value, and we'll mention those in the questions if I give you those, right? In fact, I made sure that they're added into the questions, okay? Any other questions on that one? Yeah, so I'll add in one thing here and then we'll go to 31, just because I know what I was on the exam, so I know what might be worth your time, right? Let's say the price of pizza goes up, right? What's going to happen to my marginal rate of substitution? Well, what is my marginal rate of substitution? We said it's the margin utility of the X good over the margin utility of the Y good. But if I'm spending optimally or maximizing utility, that should also be the same as the relative prices. So if the price of pizza has went up, what's going to happen on this graph? Well, if I just think through the equation, what should be true about my new marginal rate of substitution? If my denominator is larger, my new marginal rate of substitution is going to be lower. Right? Now, if I think about that in the context here, if the price of pizza goes up and I'm only buying textbooks, how many can I buy? The exact same amount. But if I'm only buying pizza, can I buy more or less than before? So what has happened to the slope of my budget constraint? It's gotten flatter. Well, the slope of my budget constraint should be the slope of my new indifference curve. So my new marginal rate of substitution should be lower. Here's the visual, or you can think about it through the equation. Okay? So I would be able to know, like, how does my marginal rate of substitution or how does the slope of my budget constraint change if I have a change in prices? Okay? And then what was the question you had on 31? Okay? So if I look at 31, okay. So on 31, this would be a slight caveat here. It probably should be, I think I updated the file yesterday, so I changed the language a little bit, okay? So what we're told is that at a quantity of 10, my average variable costs are equal to 20, and at the 11th unit, my marginal costs are equal to 18, right? So I've got numbers here, but a very quick depiction of a firm's cost structure will be able to help me answer this question much easier. So the actual question is, what happens to the average variable or average total costs for this firm? Okay. Well, my average total cost will always have this kind of U shape to it. My average variable cost will also be U-shaped, but will be above or below my average total. Well, average total would be my average variable plus my average fixed. So we said not only is the average variable below, but what's happening to that gap? It's getting smaller. And then if I wanted to add in my marginal costs, it's going to hit both of my averages at their minimum point. So right now I'm at like a quantity of 10, and the current average variable cost is above my marginal cost, right? So I'm at an average variable cost that is above my marginal cost of the 11th unit. So if my marginal cost is below the average variable, what has to be true? I can think about this as like my old. What has to be true about my new average variable cost? It must be, so I always kind of phrase this in terms of a grade. If you've got currently a 70 in the class and you get a 60 on the next exam, your grade is going to be lower. You added a value below your old average, so your new average has to be lower, right? Or the average variable cost is decreasing. So we know because that marginal cost is below the old average, our new average variable cost must be less than 20, right? So I think, right, average variable cost must be less than 20 is the answer there, right? Now, we don't know what's happening kind of to marginal cost because technically, I could still be on this portion of my marginal cost curve where it's still decreasing, which if my marginal costs were decreasing, what do I know is true about my marginal product of labor? I must be having gains from specialization. So I would know that connection between the marginal product of labor and marginal costs. If I've got gains from specialization, the marginal product of labor is going up, my marginal costs are actually going down, and then vice versa. As soon as diminishing returns take over, what's happening to my marginal costs? They begin to increase. Okay? So if you're thinking about, I'm trying to add some things into questions that are being asked, but if I'm just looking at my marginal costs, whenever my marginal costs are decreasing, we know we've got gains from specialization. As soon as my marginal costs start to increase, I must be on that diminishing returns portion for my marginal product of labor. Okay? All right, we talked about that kind of connection and we kind of stacked the graphs, but I would know how to understand whether or not I've got gains from specialization or diminishing returns just based on my marginal cost values. You can look at it looking at the actual marginal product of labor values as well, but you can also determine it from just looking at your marginal cost, which is maybe something I would know how to do before the exam, okay? What do we got, 10 minutes? Any other questions we have here? Let me see if there's anything else I wrote down that we didn't quite get to. We talked about subsidies. We talked about that one. We talked about that one. I would be able to answer the following questions as well, right? So if I have something that looks like this, if I'm looking at the 15th worker, how would I identify what the marginal product of labor is? So my marginal product of labor should be the change in what? Quantity or output divided by a change in the quantity of labor or the number of workers, right? So what's changing, right? What am I looking at? I'm looking at how many units of output are my workers adding. So output is changing, that's what's in my numerator, divided by a change in what? A change in the quantity of labor. So for my 15th worker, how much was my output changing by when I went from 10 to 15 workers? 15. But it's not 15, right? Because it's a change in output divided by a change in the number of workers. So 15 over 5, giving me my marginal product of labor of, 3. Now, am I experiencing gains from specialization or diminishing returns? So if I was like adding in a marginal product of labor curve here, or sorry, marginal product of labor column. So let's go to insert, column to the right. We just said at 15, this was 3. So to determine whether or not I have gains from specialization, what do I actually need to figure out? What the marginal product of labor was, right B, for that. So going from 5 to 10, what was the change in my output? 30 divided by a change in the quantity of labor of 30 over 5 was. So if my marginal productivity of labor is going down, I must have diminishing returns. In fact, I could also ask you, just from this table, at that 15th worker, what's happening to my marginal costs? Well, if I've got diminishing returns, I know my marginal cost must be going up. All right, that's another type of question I could ask you from this table as well. I'm not just wasting my breath here. This might be something you see on the exam. Okay? All right. Any other kind of quick questions that we've got? Yeah, so all we're talking about with economies, diseconomies of scale is we're looking at that long run. Oh, come on, there we go. We're looking at our long run average total cost curve. Anytime I'm scaling up production and my average or my per unit costs are going down, is that a good or a bad thing? Good. So we kind of call that economies of scale. If I ever increase my output and it increases my average or my per unit cost, is that a good or a bad thing? Bad, I've got, I can't spell, hold on. Diseconomies of scale. We said there can be this portion in the middle where I'm changing output, my per unit costs stay the same. This would be my constant returns to scale. Yeah. So that's about the extent you would need to kind of understand these economies of scale. Okay. Basically, I would have to tell you average total costs or ask you if I'm on the diseconomies of scale and I increase quantity, would my average total go up or down, right? We just need to know really that directional change for these different ranges, right? If I increase quantity here, now I could work in the opposite too, right? If I'm on the diseconomies of scale portion and I decrease quantity, what's actually happening to my average total costs? They'd be going down, right? So I could kind of flip, right? That's where people ask me about additional questions. I'm telling you, you can run these through AI, you can run, generate all this stuff. Quantity is not going to be more beneficial in this class. In fact, it creates more noise, especially if you're using AIs, because there's bad materials out there. There's materials out there that are easier than this class. There's materials out there that are harder. So it's going to generate questions for you that don't look as similar to the level that I'm asking you about. So it's going to be more noise. If you create more variance in the type of questions, your actual understanding should actually get worse, right? So this is why I would rely on the materials I've given you. Work through these practice exam problems. Now, obviously, I gave you like 30 some here. There's not that many questions. I'm probably going to have like 2-part questions. So there might be like, a lot of these questions are written as individual concepts, but for any of those, I can make it into one question that includes 2 concepts, right? I would also look at those questions and think about, just because I see the answer, can I actually build out? I should have a graph or an equation that supports why the correct answer is what it is. And then if I want additional questions, I would look at the questions I gave you and think about, okay, what happens if I change increase to decrease? Or going back, kind of like I did earlier today, if instead of asking you about the price consumers pay, what if he asked me about the price that sellers keep? If I asked him about, or asked you about consumer surplus, well, what if I asked you about producer surplus, right? So think about, it's the same model, it's the same concepts, but could I answer a slightly different question related to this exact same concept? And a lot of times that's just directional changes, increasing instead of decreasing quantity, increasing instead of decreasing price, et cetera, et cetera. So before you get out of here, I'm interested in this today. So I've got it set, I think, to be 5 minutes before the end of class. This is just a survey, so this isn't worth any points. So I guess if you don't give a rat's ass about me, you don't have to take any time to fill this out. But I might look at correlations and have some statements to make after the exam about what attendance today looked like with exam scores. I have an idea about what that correlation is going to be, but these questions are just opinion-based. Once again, there's no points that are going to be awarded. I'm just trying to collect information to kind of see, A, moving forward, like what types of concepts have been the most difficult for people. We have quite a variety of concepts in this second exam, right? Modules look pretty different from one another. So after the exam, we'll kind of pick up on material. Some modules have, you know, more or less from different ones. So I want to see, what did you struggle with the most prior to exam 2? And that might kind of change how much time I focus on things in certain modules after exam 2. Just kind of curious to see kind of confidence in what you expect your score to be, assuming the average is a 75, right? So assuming the mean of this exam, I can expect it's probably going to be somewhere between 75 and 80. Let's assume it's a 75. Which of these categories do you think your grade would be in? And then kind of which of the following do you find most helpful? And then I'll probably take these to see if you were in class here today. I think, oh, what did I have it set to be? It was the score of the Colts game. Oops. So 38.14 should get you kind of into that. So I just want to kind of have you see if you were here today. 38.14 will get you into that. Opinion-based questions. This is just for me to kind of see what you're struggling with the most, kind of see what types of students are over, under confident, and then what materials have you found or do you think have been the most useful when you're studying or getting closer to exams. And then I'll kind of try to adjust things moving forward based off these responses from the entire class. Okay? Any other questions for me just related to logistics of the exam? I should be in my office for typical office hours tomorrow from 10 to 1. So if you get there like right at 10 and the door is shut, I'm guessing it'll be open the rest of the time, given how many people showed up yesterday. I would suggest getting there early because I have to be gone right at 1 o'clock. Okay? So 10 to 1 tomorrow, last kind of office hours for me. You've got those additional free tutoring sessions that are both tonight and tomorrow night. Otherwise, I will see you guys for the exam on Thursday.